The Last of Us is a game that many people will tell you is the greatest of all time. It's an absolute classic. Anyone with a PS3 or PS4 should play it because the story is the best you'll ever find in gaming. And most people, myself included, will probably be baffled by claims like this, because admittedly, The Last of Us does not look like much on the surface. It's easy to watch all the trailers and playthroughs and think that this is just another zombie game injected into an oversaturated genre with a shallow story in which you escort a young girl that's immune to the zombie infection across the country and hope that she can be used to create a vaccine. Seriously, most folks probably heard about the story and thought, an entire game that's just one large escort mission? The worst part about any game ever? Stretched out across a 10 to 15 hour story? No thanks, f that, I think I'll stick to Uncharted. It's only when you fire the game up and experience it for yourself that it just clicks. You understand the hype. You understand that on top of just being a really well-written story, it goes deeper than just bringing some little brat on a road trip to the other side of the country during a zombie apocalypse. It's a story about characters and the relationships they form, specifically the main characters, Joel and Ellie, as they try to survive in this nightmare of a post-apocalyptic world. I was one of the many that just didn't get it before I played. I was very hesitant to try out The Last of Us at first. With all the praise it was constantly getting about its story, it definitely piqued my interest a little bit. I absolutely adore good story-driven games like God of War and Red Dead Redemption 2. But stealth shooter type games weren't really my thing, and I could never really get into the whole zombie genre up until that point. I didn't see a way the story could possibly be good enough to carry the whole game for me. But then one fateful day in January 2020, I noticed that The Last of Us Remastered was one of the free games you could download through PlayStation Plus. And I thought, what the hell? It's one of the PlayStation classics after all, and it's free. I thought I might as well give it a try. It's not like I had anything else going on back in high school. I wasn't pulling any bitches, that's for sure. Alright, I thought. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna download it. I got it downloaded a few days later. I loaded the game up, and I was absolutely hooked in the first 30 minutes. That opening, man, it has to be one of the best in all of gaming. Just watching the world go to complete shit before your very eyes makes you curious to see what state it's in now. And then of course there's the absolutely gut-wrenching scene where Joel's daughter bleeds out and dies in his arms. This lets you know right off the bat that there are very few lines this game won't cross and you're in for an emotional roller coaster. I wanted more. I wanted to feel more. I love it when games can pull such powerful emotions from me, whether it be happy or sad. As of now, I've completed The Last of Us a total of 5 times. That's more times than I've kissed a female. It should be pretty obvious that I absolutely adore this game, and I really just want to talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time. So sit down, grab your snacks, grab your drinks, and let's waste precious time talking about a world and characters that don't even exist. First, I want to discuss the history leading up to the game because I think it's important to bring light to what Naughty Dog was thinking when they decided to develop this very dark and mature game. Now, if you don't care about any of this and want to get right to where I talk story stuff, don't you worry. Post-production Aaron should have chapters set up so you can skip right ahead to the parts you're interested in. I wouldn't count on it though, he's kinda, well... Oh, don't worry, Aaron. I just gotta finish drying up these dishes and then I'll get those chapters set up. Thank you, post-production Aaron. The Last of Us was a pretty drastic turn for Naughty Dog, considering the games they've developed in the past. They were responsible for developing the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy and the Jak and Daxter games. They were responsible for developing the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy and Jak and Daxter games. They also developed the more mature but still pretty tame Uncharted games. Development on The Last of Us began in the middle of the development of The Last of Us began in the middle of the development of Uncharted 3. The team knew they wanted to get a head start on a new game, but were unsure at first of what it should be. They tossed around ideas such as simply starting another Uncharted game or revisiting old series such as Jak and Daxter. They eventually decided they wanted to do something new, and this time, something much more mature, not just in terms of violence, but in its tones and themes. They wanted to push themselves. They wanted to tell a darker story that would be difficult to tell in a T-rated game like Uncharted, which was their most notable series at the time. Last of Us was obviously a big departure from Uncharted. Sure, the game can have intense moments. When you're not climbing around on rocks and stuff, you're mowing down armies of people with little to no repercussions. But it's all being restrained by its T rating. With The Last of Us, on the other hand, Naughty Dog decided to go all in on an M rating. They needed to have almost no restraints as to what they could show so they could reinforce the game's darker tone. In Uncharted, you kill a bunch of lifeless NPCs that feel more like targets than people. It never feels too brutal. At the end of the day, it's just supposed to be a lighthearted action-adventure romp. In The Last of Us, a man is forced to shoot his little brother in the head after he becomes infected, and then he shoots himself in the head on screen out of grief. It's pretty dark stuff. With how big of a transition it was from Uncharted to The Last of Us, Naughty Dog was skeptical of how the game would be received. They thought some players would be turned off by its darker and more depressing story. Some of the developers thought that this game would straight up ruin Naughty Dog's image and would be the downfall of the company, which sounds absolutely crazy in retrospect, but can you really blame them? Instead of releasing a new entry in their beloved lighthearted action-adventure series Uncharted, they decided to create an entirely new IP with unestablished characters, with a super dark, depressing, and bleak story, and tossing it into a wildly oversaturated genre, being a post-apocalyptic zombie game. It seemed like they were sending the game out to die, but deep down they thought their idea was cool. They really wanted to tell a deep story about a growing father-daughter relationship between two strangers as they desperately try to survive in a violent, cutthroat world. So how did they do? They did alright. The Last of Us released on June 13th, 2013 to critical and commercial acclaim. It was receiving perfect scores left and right, and many people believed that not only was it the best narrative-driven game ever, but the best game ever. People went absolutely bonkers over this game. I just wasn't aware of it at the time. I didn't have a PS3, I was too busy dicking around on my Wii. In the end, it turned out their risk paid off. The Last of Us was a massive success. But why exactly? Let's get into the story stuff now. You might think that with all the hype around this game that it was an innovation and reimagined what story-driven games could be, in the same way that a game like Breath of the Wild reimagined what an open-world game could be. But this isn't exactly the case. The game was simply created by a group of talented people who have a strong knowledge of storytelling, video games, and how to interweave them, and who also just had great ideas. At the heart of the story are the two main characters, Ellie and Joel, and the relationship that grows between them as they traverse the country together. This is truly what the game is all about. Even though any story synopsis online says that it's about two people who travel through a post-apocalyptic world in hopes of finding a cure, the real story comes from the two protagonists' growing father-daughter relationship. Ellie and Joel have the most genuine feeling and organic relationship growth I have ever seen in any movie, TV show, or video game. One of my biggest pet peeves in any story is when two characters begin to warm up and trust each other way too fast. When I played GTA 5 for the first time, I remember being really confused by how quickly Franklin and Michael became all buddy-buddy with each other. It's like they meet one day, and the next day they're already shaking each other's dicks after they pee. Like, come on, it took me and my bros at least a week before we got to that point. The bond that grows between Joel and Ellie always feels completely natural. Keep in mind, at the start of the apocalypse, Joel lost his one and only daughter, so naturally he's going to be hesitant to develop a connection with anyone. This is a natural defense from being hurt like that again, especially when the person is a young teenage girl that reminds him just a little bit too much of his dead daughter. The writers at Naughty Dog knew that it was vital that they take their time letting this relationship blossom and to not rush things. At the start of the game, Ellie and Joel's interactions go exactly as you'd expect. Joel sees Ellie as some bratty little shit, and Ellie sees Joel as some grumpy old hard-ass. Their early interactions are stiff, awkward, and passive-aggressive.
Hey, look! Gnomes!
Yeah, those are gnomes.
Man, I had an art book filled with these. I always thought they were super cute. Not fairies, though. They creep me out.
Alright, man.
Joel has a hard time taking Ellie seriously since she's a child. You can see the tension even in their body language. The developers thought to animate Ellie with her arms crossed even outside of cutscenes to show just how uncomfortable she initially feels around Joel. It's stuff like this that makes the game so fun to replay. You see how cold and bitter they are towards each other, but all you can think of are the sweet, tender moments between them later in the game. It's a strangely warm and fuzzy feeling for a game that pulls shit like...
No!
After going on their journey across the country together, the two become inseparable. They've been through so much together after all, and Naughty Dog made it 100% believable that they care so much about each other. It's hard to get people to understand through words alone how incredible the bond between Joel and Ellie is, but maybe going through their entire journey beat by beat and talking about all their big moments will help you understand it a little better. So without further ado, let's go through a brief rundown of the journey that Joel and Ellie go on so we can see exactly how their relationship blooms. The two meet through Marlene, the head of the Fireflies. Marlene offers Joel and his partner Tess a large stash of weapons in exchange for smuggling a certain package to the Fireflies, who are located in the Capitol building. It is later revealed that this certain package is in fact Ellie. Also, little side note, I've always really appreciated the way they introduce Ellie into the story. Even though she's one of the main characters, she wasn't forced into the story. What I mean by this is that many other stories would have introduced her with, like, a dramatic music cue and a spotlight over her. And yeah, before you say anything, she's literally on the box art of the game, so it's pretty obvious she's gonna be at least a little significant to the story, but I still thought it was neat that she just kind of casually shows up and attacks Tess and Joel with a knife. Her entrance wasn't cheesed up or anything. It felt totally natural, and it makes the relationship that blooms between Ellie and Joel way cooler, because their introduction to each other is framed as two strangers casually bumping into each other. Anyway, when Marlene asks Joel to watch over Ellie, while she takes Tess to look at the weapons, they both immediately object, but eventually begrudgingly accept. And now they're alone for the very first time, and it is just nothing but constant bickering between the two. At one point, Ellie comments on Joel's broken watch, and, as you can imagine, the watch is a bit of a touchy subject for Joel. They do have a somewhat tender moment when Ellie is talking about how she's never been so close to the outside of the quarantine zone, though calling it tender is kind of a stretch. Tess shows up again and confirms that the weapons are in fact real and that this mission is worth doing. With that in mind, they begin their journey to the Capitol building. But things go south very quickly as the trio are intercepted by a group of soldiers who scan them for infection. And it's here that it's revealed that Ellie is in fact infected. She tries to explain to them that she is somehow immune and that the reason they're taking her to the Fireflies is so they can somehow use her immunity to create a vaccine. Joel and Tess are not quick to believe this, but their discussion is cut short when more soldiers arrive. Tess does eventually decide to give her the benefit of the doubt and finish the mission, but Joel still isn't buying into the whole thing. The first time Ellie and Joel show any signs of warming up to each other is when they are admiring the view of the Capitol building. After this brief exchange, Joel looks down at his broken watch that was given to him by his daughter Sarah, implying that Ellie reminds him of her in some way. Joel tries his best to fight these feelings for Ellie. That sounded weird, Ellie is like 14. Joel tries his best to fight these fatherly feelings for Ellie, but this is a battle he ultimately and inevitably loses. Once they reach the building, they find that all the Fireflies have been killed. Tess begs Joel to take Ellie to where the Fireflies actually are and finish the job. It is here that Tess reveals that she has been infected, and considering that she was bitten very recently and it's already worse than Ellie's bite, she finally buys into Ellie being immune. When the military arrives at the Capitol, Tess says that she will hold them off while they escape because she refuses to become an infected. After they escape, when Ellie tries to apologize about what happened to Tess, it is then revealed to Ellie and the player how Joel deals with loss. He simply never talks about them and pretends that they never existed. As mentioned before, this is how he dealt with the death of his daughter, Sarah. He chose to forget he ever had a daughter and that she died. But the truth is, he did have a daughter, and she is very much dead. He would know that if he read her Wikipedia article. As they continue their journey, they meet up with an old acquaintance of Joel's named Bill in hopes that he can provide them with a car. Bill is a paranoid, selfish, and obsessive survivalist. He has a very specific set of rules for survival that he follows to a T. He tolerates Joel, but he cannot stand Ellie and her immaturity. He believes Joel will wind up dead looking after her. Bill is constantly belittling Ellie throughout their entire time together, and can never respond to anything she says without sarcasm. Even though Joel still isn't too fond of Ellie at this point in the story, he still makes some effort to stand up for her when Bill gets all pissy. Towards the end of the trio's time together, after they've managed to secure a truck, the player has the option to initiate an optional conversation with Ellie, where Joel reassures her that she's doing a good job. He's beginning to no longer see her as a hindrance and can at least pull her own weight. Ellie and Joel take the truck and drive off to the next phase of the story. While traveling, the player gets to experience the only scene in the entire game that is purely dedicated to comedy. Ellie reveals that she robbed Bill of one of his precious porn mags. Joel says it's not for kids and tells her to get rid of it, but Ellie insists on seeing what all the fuss is about. She then questions why all the pages are stuck together, but Joel is too embarrassed to explain to Ellie that Bill spilled syrup all over the pages while eating his delicious stack of pancakes. You know, as most of us dudes do while looking at lewd images. Hey Aaron, have you seen my... She pitches the magazine out the window and they continue their journey until they eventually get stranded in Pittsburgh after being jumped by some hunters. This is where the next key moment in their relationship takes place. At one point while the duo are separated, Joel is just climbing a ladder, minding his own business when suddenly, He gets jumped by one of the hunters. They struggle for a while. Joel tries to reach his gun, and eventually Ellie comes to the rescue and shoots the offender in the face. Ellie is clearly shaken up by this. This is her first time taking a human life after all. How would you expect her to act? Ellie is definitely looking for some sort of consolation from Joel, but she is just not getting any. Instead of being grateful, he's offended that his life was saved by a 14-year-old, and says that she should have stayed behind like he told her to. The two later walk out onto a balcony overlooking a very video game looking arena, with a rifle conveniently sitting right next to them. This right here is one of my favorite moments in the entire game. After pondering the event that happened earlier, Joel decides to let Ellie use the rifle to provide him with some cover while he takes care of business down in the arena. He then gets to live out every Midwestern father's wet dream of getting to teach their kid how to use a gun in a zombie apocalypse. After proving that she can handle a firearm, Joel allows her to keep a handgun to use for emergencies only, further building the trust between the two. Ellie can do more than carry her own weight now. She can now be a real asset to Joel. The next phase of Joel and Ellie's journey is the introduction of the brotherly duo Sam and Henry. Their first encounter is a hostile one, but upon realizing that both pairs include a child, they realize that they're not one of the hunters because they don't keep kids around. They form an alliance working together to escape Pittsburgh. Everything seems to be going well until Henry decides to ditch Joel, leaving him stranded with a military Humvee hot on his heels. Now Ellie, bless her soul, returns to Joel and says, "We stick together. Look at how far they've come."
Fuck away from me!
Some more stuff happens, none of it's super important to their relationship, just some light bonding moments as they fight their way to the radio tower. But the thing is, they never make it to the radio tower. Because the arc of Sam and Henry ends with Sam getting infected and Henry shooting him in the head to save Ellie. Henry is so mortified by what he just did that he shoots himself right in the head in front of Joel and Ellie. Now I believe this is important because shared trauma brings people closer together. No joke, this is pretty much exactly how my parents met. After witnessing Sam and Henry's demise, Joel and Ellie are acting a lot closer than they ever have before. This isn't necessarily just due to the fact that they witnessed a suicide together. A lot happened during their time in Pittsburgh. But I'd say it played a role in bringing them closer together. This seems to be the first time they're having conversations with each other that aren't filled with passive aggression. They straight up enjoy each other's company now. It's also worth noting that after the downfall of Sam and Henry, Joel continues to shut Ellie up whenever she tries to bring them up. Ellie really wants to talk about it, but Joel believes that nothing good will come from dwelling on their memory. He instead chooses to lie to himself and act like they never existed to make himself feel better, just like I lie to myself in the mirror every morning. I'll find love someday. The next stop on the Joel and Ellie adventure is Tommy's place. He, along with some engineers, are trying to get the dam up and running so they can use the river to power their hometown, Jackson. This is where their journey should theoretically end. Joel's whole plan was basically to dump Ellie onto Tommy and have him and his men escort her to the Fireflies. It'd be a pretty climactic ending, don't you think?
You finish the job, you collect the whole damn payment.
All right.
Now, Joel claims that he wants Tommy to finish the job because Tommy used to be a Firefly and should be able to escort Ellie to the remaining ones just fine. It's made very apparent that the real reason is because Joel can feel himself getting more attached to Ellie than he wants to. At this point, they have gone through so much together. He doesn't want to get that close to someone ever again after what happened to Sarah, so he thinks it's best to just cut her out of his life before it's too late. It takes some persuading, but eventually Tommy agrees to take Ellie off of Joel's hands. Upon hearing what Joel plans to do, Ellie yoinks one of the horses and rides off. Once Joel finally manages to catch up to her, we are presented with what is probably the most important scene in the entire game. This is the scene where the relationship between Joel and Ellie is made official. Ellie is able to see right through Joel's bullshit. She essentially calls Joel out for viewing her as his daughter Sarah and also trying to get rid of her the entire time. Joel continues to lie and says Tommy is more capable of delivering her to the Fireflies, but Ellie argues that she'll be just fine, especially since it's impossible for her to get infected. She eventually says,
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
But Joel responds with,
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways.
Their conversation is cut short when a group of invaders find their way into the house. While you're busy taking human lives, Joel and the player are given time to ponder the heavy conversation that just happened. You start to realize that these two need each other, and not just for the sake of their own survival. While it's true that both are an asset to each other in terms of fighting their way through the zombie-infested world, the reason they need each other is much more personal. Joel needs Ellie to help fill in the hole that was left behind by Sarah, and Ellie needs that father figure that she never had growing up. Joel finally realizes this by the time they return to Jackson. Joel tells Tommy that he's decided to finish what he started and lead Ellie to the Fireflies. By agreeing to escort her through the remaining miles of their journey, Joel is essentially committing to Ellie as her surrogate father. He is allowing himself to open up and care for her. He hasn't let himself do this much since Sarah died. Both Joel and Ellie take a huge risk here. By letting themselves care for, and one might even say love, another human being, they are risking the devastating feelings that come when the person you hold dear perishes, which happens far too often in this sick and twisted world. This is a risk they are willing to take, because to live fully, you have to be willing to love fully, even if it gets you hurt in the end. With that in mind, Joel decides to commit to Ellie as her father figure, allowing them both to be vulnerable to the devastating feelings of grief that will come if something were to happen to one of them. What a moron, right? Tommy informs them that the remaining Fireflies are located at the University of Eastern Colorado. The now father-daughter duo continues their journey on horseback, and the game cuts straight to them arriving at the college. The scene opens with a really fun conversation between Joel and Ellie, where Joel is trying to explain to her how football works, but she just does not understand it at all. As they're exploring the university, they start to realize that something is off. There are no Fireflies to be seen patrolling the area. Weird, right? I remember playing through this for the first time and thinking, man, I sure hope this doesn't lead to Joel getting impaled. They scour the buildings for signs of Fireflies, but they are nowhere to be found. They eventually stumble across a voice recorder, which is apparently incredibly popular to use in the world of The Last of Us, and basically find out that this post has been abandoned, and all of the Fireflies have moved to a lab in Salt Lake City. They have very little time to discuss this turn of events as a group of attackers suddenly invade the building, forcing the pair to begin their escape. They don't do a very good job at this because moments later during their escape, Joel is shoved off a balcony and is impaled by an inconveniently positioned rebar. Ellie naturally panics upon realizing that Joel doesn't have life insurance and rushes down to aid him. It's here that Ellie is really able to showcase how much Joel has taught her over the course of their journey. This time, she is the one escorting Joel. As Joel hobbles behind her, she stands at the front, shooting down attackers with very little help from Joel. Also, I want to take a moment to appreciate the writer's decision with how to deal with Joel in this situation. The Last of Us is a game that prides itself in being a very grounded story, meaning there are very few moments where the player is forced to suspend their disbelief, because the game world follows the rules that it has set up for itself nearly 100% of the time. Most of the events that happen are completely believable in this post-apocalyptic world they have created. Joel barely being able to function after getting completely skewered in the side like this is a perfect example. Joel is very tough, there's no doubt about that. He has been fighting through hell and back for the last 20 years. He's likely been in situations like this before. So naturally, he's going to have a much higher pain tolerance than the vast majority of people in our world. But at the end of the day, Joel is still only human. He's not invincible, so instead of just having him get up and continue to fight with little to no hindrance, the writers constructed this scene so that he is almost completely helpless. The player is forced to control him while he just stumbles around, and it's hard not to cringe as you watch him barely able to climb through windows and mount his horse. It's really hard to watch, and it's really well done. Anyways, mental digression. Joel and Ellie are able to get back to the horse and ride away, but eventually Joel just can't handle it anymore. He passes out and falls right off his horse. Ellie tries to wake him, desperately asking him for instruction before the game suddenly cuts to winter. It opens on this iconic scene of Ellie killing a bunny. Joel is nowhere to be found, leading the player to question his fate. He's alive, in case you were wondering, but don't you worry, his time will come. Ellie shoots a deer with her bow and trails it to what appears to be a rundown town area. It is here that we meet our friendly neighborhood pedophile and cannibal, David. Don't you worry, his time will come. David offers to trade Ellie something for the deer that she shot. Ellie quickly says she needs antibiotics, and gamers everywhere breathe with a sigh of relief when they realize she's probably talking about our video game daddy. Someone leaves to go grab the penicillin, leaving Ellie alone with David in a cabin. She is naturally very hesitant to trust him, but they are forced to work together when suddenly they are swarmed by a large group of infected. The pair are eventually forced to flee, and this is basically the game's way of not only giving you some zombie slaying action, but also giving Ellie and the player a chance to trust our pedo-cannibal friend. Upon returning to the cabin, it is revealed that David is searching for a man that massacred some of his men at the University of Eastern Colorado. He also knows that this mystery man just so happens to be traveling with a little girl. That could be anybody. David figures it's Ellie, but he lets her off the hook, claiming that it's not her fault. Ellie takes the penicillin and runs like hell. She arrives in an abandoned garage where she has Joel stashed away and injects him with some of the medicine, before falling asleep beside him. Her rest is eventually interrupted by David's men who have tracked her, forcing her to flee on her horse and try to lure them away from an incapacitated Joel. She's successful in protecting Joel, but her horse is eventually shot down. And after killing more of David's men, she is captured and thrown in a cage to potentially be eaten by cannibals. Yeah, apparently David had a change of heart, but I suppose murdering another couple dozen of his friends will do that to you.
I got this fucking... Whoa!
Ellie wakes up in her cage to find someone chopping up a dead body to use for food. David eventually greets her and tries to charm her again, saying that he might be able to convince the others to keep her alive. After exchanging some rather creepy dialogue implying that David likes him young, Ellie manages to break David's fingering finger and tries to grab his keys, but is unsuccessful. David implies that he will now use Ellie for meat, which is arguably better than the other option, leaving Ellie scared and alone. Until Joel wakes up, ladies and gentlemen, he is back in action. That penicillin sure worked fast, didn't it? The gaping hole in his side hardly hinders him as he fights through David's men and searches for Ellie. Yeah, I thought it was a little strange that he's able to get up and fight just fine. I think even doing something like making it so you can't sprint or slowing down some of the attack animations would have gone a long way in making it more believable. Because after playing as relatively weak Ellie for the past hour or so, the writers really wanted to make you feel like a god while playing as Joel, so they gave him his full strength so they could better juxtapose his strength to Ellie's, while letting you use your flamethrower and shotgun to your heart's content and have no drawback. They do make the NPCs run away screaming after you fight them a little, so it kind of furthers the idea that they really wanted to play up Joel's strength. Anyway, Joel manages to capture some of David's goons, and this is where you truly get to see the lengths that Joel will go to protect Ellie. The next scene involves Joel slowly beating, stabbing, and bludgeoning David's men to get info on Ellie's whereabouts. One of them claims that she's David's newest pet. You can probably piece together what that means. And then he points to her location on the map. Joel kisses them goodnight and heads off to find Ellie, who did manage to escape by the way, and is currently battling David in an abandoned restaurant. At one point, Ellie gets knocked to the ground, and David mounts her and has her pinned, but Ellie is just barely able to reach his machete and just lets him have it. This next scene is so important. Joel pulls Ellie away from a now demolished David and tries to console her. They then embrace for the first time in the entire game after Joel refers to her as Baby Girl, the same name he used for his biological daughter at the beginning of the game. The two walk off and we now enter the final phase of the game. We're almost done, guys. The pair walk through a city with the hospital in sight. The two are having simple conversations and they are closer than they have ever been, though Ellie is still visibly shaken by her encounter with David. She eventually cheers up when they find a herd of giraffes. No, I am not making that up. The Last of Us does like to bring up these interesting ideas of what kind of weird stuff would happen during a zombie apocalypse, and this is one of them. With no one to take care of them, it's reasonable to assume that animals would escape from their habitats at zoos and stuff, releasing all sorts of exotic animals into the wild. It's a pretty cool idea. Ellie and Joel spend some time petting the giraffe, and you get this neat little moment where they're both chilling on the balcony, taking in the view of the herd peacefully existing in nature. It's probably the happiest and most peaceful moment in the entire game. Everything is all fine and dandy. We're in the end game now. Joel is about to deliver Ellie to the Fireflies, who are going to use her to create a cure for the infection and save mankind. But in this moment, you're allowed to just relax, take in the view, and move forward in the game whenever you feel like it. I sure hope this doesn't lead to Joel murdering a bunch of hospital workers. At one point on their way to the hospital, Ellie reveals that Tommy gave her a picture of Joel and Sarah and offers it to Joel. Joel says,
Well, no matter how hard you try, I guess you can't escape your past. Thank you.
And accepts the picture, showing how far he's come by now accepting the memory of Sarah. After taking a little swim, Joel and Ellie are met by some Firefly soldiers who kiss Joel goodnight. Alright, finale time. He later wakes up in bed with Marlene sitting right next to him, and she asks how he was able to traverse the entire country through a zombie apocalypse, and Joel claims it was all Ellie, and that she fought like hell to get here. Marlene then reveals that they have to kill Ellie in order to create the vaccine. As you can imagine, Joel does not take this very well. Every person he has ever opened himself up to, every time he has ever allowed himself to be vulnerable by caring for and loving someone, they have either died or left him. He thought that maybe he could finally catch a break with Ellie, but unfortunately that was not the case. Joel is about to lose another daughter and be all on his own yet again. This is such a sick, twisted, yet brilliantly crafted twist ending. Joel's entire journey across the states was simply leading Ellie to her own grave. He is now given a choice. He can steal Ellie from the Fireflies and go on to live a happy life with her at Tommy's town, or he can sacrifice his daughter so that the Fireflies can potentially create a cure for the infection, effectively creating a way for the world to someday go back to the way it was. But that wouldn't make a very good sequel now, would it? Joel decides to do what I think most parents would do in a similar situation and decides to take back his daughter. Now, people will interpret this ending in many different ways. Some believe Joel is nothing other than a hero because he was just doing what any parent would have done in that situation. Or some think he's a hero because the Fireflies are a joke and they were just going to sacrifice some 14-year-old girl for shits and giggles. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there are people who believe that Joel is Satan himself because he essentially screwed all of humanity to save his surrogate daughter that he has only known for about a year. And then there is the camp of people in the middle, which is where my perspective lies. The thing you have to understand about Joel is that he, according to Neil Druckmann, is a man with very few moral lines left to cross. He is an anti-hero through and through. He will do anything to protect himself and his pack, no matter how many people have to die. We see this at the very beginning of the game, at the start of the pandemic, where there is a family stranded on the side of the road begging for help. But he ignores them because he can't risk bringing an infected person in the same car as his brother and daughter. Joel is cold-hearted and Joel is selfish, and those are not words people like to use to describe the main characters of stories, especially characters as beloved as Joel. But it's true, and it's what makes him such an interesting character. He's just a guy doing whatever he has to do for the survival of himself and the ones he loves. I, of course, will respect anyone's opinion on the matter. Everyone is going to interpret these things in different ways, and that's what makes talking about video games and stories so much fun. I just don't understand why some people are so hell-bent on trying to position Joel as being a hero when that strips him of everything that makes him so interesting as a character. He's not a villain, he had no malicious intentions, he was just doing what most people would have probably done in the same situation. But many, many people are going to continue to die because of Joel's actions, which is not very heroic. It's such a complicated climax in all the right ways. It really makes you think, and I just love it so much. So yeah, Joel yoinks Ellie off the operation table and carries her out of the hospital, mimicking the time he carried Sarah at the beginning of the game. And at the final stretch of the escape, he kisses Marlene goodnight, but like forever, and he drives off with Ellie. Now obviously Joel is going to need an explanation for Ellie as to what happened. He lies and basically says that there have been dozens of others who have been immune to the virus, and that all attempts to use them to create a cure have failed, including Ellie. This doesn't really explain why Joel stole her off the operating table while she was still unconscious, but she doesn't question it for the time being and falls back asleep while Joel takes them back to Tommy's place. The game cuts to Joel and Ellie on foot on the outskirts of Tommy's town, Jackson. For the last few minutes of the game, the player now has control over Ellie, drawing a parallel to the very beginning of the game when you control Sarah. As they're walking, Joel brings up his dead daughter as a conversation starter and says that he used to take walks through the woods with Sarah, just like he and Ellie are doing. After 20 long years, this brings Joel's arc with Sarah to a close. He's finally able to casually talk about her without getting upset, and he can just look back on the good times. In the final scene in the game, Ellie brings up all the people in her life that have died because of the infection, and tells Joel to swear to her that everything he told her about the Fireflies is true. Joel swears, Ellie gives a very hesitant and half-hearted okay, and then the credits roll. Okay, so obviously Ellie sees right through Joel's bullshit, but calling it out and questioning it further might make their relationship suffer, as we see in part 2. For the sake of preserving this precious relationship, Ellie decides to go along with it for the time being and have a happily ever after with Joel, with a big old question mark by it. And that was a brief summary of Joel and Ellie's journey together. Obviously, just talking about it doesn't do the actual story justice. You really have to play the game to truly experience their growing bond, but hopefully you can at least kinda see why Joel and Ellie is one of the most revered duos in all of fiction. The story of The Last of Us thrives off the connection between these two, but that's not the only reason it was so successful. It is also because of its pacing. Now this is a term you'll hear a lot when people are discussing movies, TV shows, video games, books. Whatever medium people are capable of telling stories through, there will be people talking about the pacing of the story. But what the hell does that even mean? The best way I can think to describe pacing is the rate at which interesting or exciting events happen in a story. A story can have poor pacing for several reasons. First and most obviously, it can have poor pacing because there's simply not enough going on in the story, leaving too many stretches of uninteresting or boring events happening. On the other hand, a story can have poor pacing because there's too much going on. It's then considered a bloated story. This is a problem because having too many moments of non-stop action or drama and emotion will cause the audience to go numb to all those exciting events, and they lose their emotional impact. A well-paced story will balance out these heavy action and emotion scenes with quieter scenes so that the audience will let their guard down, so they are more impacted when things start to get bloody or something. Even high-energy, action-packed games like Doom are filled with things like puzzles to slow the gameplay down a bit and give the player a chance to breathe, and so they don't become desensitized to all the action. The Last of Us is an example of a near-perfectly paced story. All of the intense scenes hit exactly as they're supposed to, because as soon as you feel yourself letting your guard down, they hit you with something. They then give you just the right amount of time to process the event you just witnessed so it can sneak up on you with the next big thing. An excellent example of Naughty Dog utilizing good pacing is right at the beginning of the game after Sarah dies. This is likely the most emotional scene in the entire game, so the writers knew it was important to give the player plenty of time to process this traumatizing scene. So instead of just throwing the player right back into the game 20 years later, the game shows a credits scene with voices in the background explaining a little bit more about what's going on in the world. Naughty Dog is somehow able to keep up this level of writing throughout the entire game, and it is so crucial to the overall story, because it means that every jaw-dropper, every tearjerker, every twist, every turn lands exactly as it's supposed to. Good pacing is like the backbone of a story. It holds up all those big iconic moments because The Last of Us triumphs in this department, and it has some of the most iconic moments in all of gaming. God damn, the story's good. It's also really dark, so we should talk about that. As I'm sure you've pieced together by now, this game is no Kirby Return to Dreamland. It is technically labeled as a horror game after all, which might be a bit of a stretch because, sure, The Last of Us can have scary moments, but they're all more like cheap Halloween decorations from Walmart scary. They're not like PlayStation 2 no-disc inserted screen level scary. This game pulls no punches in terms of hitting you with powerful tear-jerking moments. Right from the start, this game lets you know that it's not f***ing around. That's right, we're gonna kill a f***ing kid, Neil Druckmann said in an interview promoting the game. I bet you never seen that in Kirby. Many will probably agree that the death of Joel's daughter is probably the most brutal part of the entire game. The game starts with Sarah sitting on the couch watching TV and Joel returning from what appears to have been a rough day at work. This is also the scene where Sarah gives Joel the watch for his birthday. This entire scene is very sweet, and you can tell these two really care about each other without really hamming it up. It feels like a genuine father-daughter relationship, which makes the later scene all the more brutal. When the player is first given control, they are given control of Sarah. I believe this was done on purpose for two reasons. The first and most obvious was so that they could start the game with you playing as Sarah and end it with you playing as Joel's new daughter, Ellie. But I also believe they did this because you are more likely to connect with a character when you are given control of them. It was really important that they do this because the player is only given like 20 to 30 minutes with Sarah before she's killed off, so it's important that they get you to care about her as quickly as possible. When the player first gets a hold of Joel, he is carrying his daughter who can't walk after suffering from a leg injury. All of this leads to the moment that sets the tone for the entire game. This moment tells you that for the next 10 to 15 hours, you will be crying, you will be sweating, and you will constantly be worrying about the fates of these characters. The only problem I have with this scene is that no other moment truly lives up to it, at least for me. Yeah, Sam and Henry's death was pretty traumatizing, but it still wasn't quite on the same level as a man holding his 12 or so year old daughter as she bleeds out. The game makes you watch her as she squeals, groans, and eventually draws her last breath. It sets the bar very high right off the bat, and while it's a shame no other moment in the game quite matches it, it still succeeds at hooking the player, letting them know that there are no rules as to what can happen, and most importantly, setting the tone for the entire game. This is a harsh and unforgiving post-apocalyptic world, and the game constantly reminds you of that. Tess getting infected and shot down by the military, Bill's partner Frank committing suicide, Henry shooting his infected little brother in the head, followed by him shooting himself in the head out of grief, Ellie shooting a cute little bunny, people eating other people to survive while also being sexually attracted to minors, and lastly, Joel dooming all of humanity by stealing their one and only hope of a cure. These are some of the more in-your-face examples. Throughout the game, you're able to find things like letters and voice recorders strewn across the environment that will clue you in on what was going on in other people's lives during the pandemic. For example, Sam, Henry, Joel, and Ellie crawl into the sewers and uncover what appears to be an abandoned place for survivors. It had a makeshift alarm system, some water filtration system, a list of rules written on the walls, and it also had toys littered around, implying the presence of kids. Considering the fact that the place is pretty trashed and the fact that there are some infected lurking around, you can probably piece together that things probably didn't end well for the folks living here. In fact, you'll find letters littered everywhere that paint a clearer picture of what went down. I believe there is a note somewhere that says all it took was one opening they forgot to secure before going to bed to do them in. If you want to witness something extremely dark, don't worry, I got you covered. There's actually one specific room you can go into that has the words "They didn't suffer" written on the ground. Right next to that, you'll find the corpse of a man and a few small bodies laying under a blanket. And next to the man, you'll find a note that basically explains that there were infected pounding at the door and that if it came down to it, he'd make it quick. I'm going to find another hobby. And that was just one example of the many little mini-stories you'll be able to piece together from the environment. Yes, this game is bleak, and you also have the world designed to reinforce that. Kind of. The world of The Last of Us manages to strike an incredible yin-yang balance of beauty and horror. On one hand, you'll have scenes of buildings with shattered glass and blood and bodies smeared everywhere. You have these gut-punching stories that are told through the environment. But on the other hand, you have these gorgeous shots of civilization being reclaimed by nature. It's really interesting to see how the artists imagined the world would look like in the event of an apocalypse. You'll find cities with overgrown plants digging their roots into structures and destroying them. Streets are flooded because with no one around to do maintenance on plumbing, it all eventually just fails. Exotic animals are roaming around after escaping from zoos. It's all just so interesting to look at. Let's talk about the gameplay. The gameplay of The Last of Us has always been the main point of criticism when discussing the game. Is it bad? Absolutely not. Is it as good as the story? The Last of Us is a game you 100% play for the story. If anyone tells you they only play it for the gameplay, I'm telling you from personal experience, f***ing run. You could probably best describe the gameplay as, it gets the job done. It is fun, don't get me wrong. It just does the bare minimum in giving your thumb something to do in between cutscenes. But it is important to note that I'm not even into survival horror stealth type games, and it did manage to keep me entertained between cutscenes. So, take that however you will. Something that people will always bring up is how tedious it is scavenging for materials. It's true, a very large chunk of the gameplay is made up of individually searching through hundreds upon hundreds of filing cabinets in order to find scraps to craft stuff with. I never really minded it though. This is one of the criticisms I could never really get behind. Exploring the levels and searching for useful items is always one of my favorite parts of games. And in this case, it does an excellent job in making you feel like a survivor, just scrounging around for any scraps you can find to turn into useful tools for survival. It also works so that you will be searching the environment mid-combat so you can craft items on the fly to kill your enemies. And I always thought that was really cool. There's a pretty good selection of different things you can craft. First off is the med kit, which will, get this, heal you.
Shut the f*** up!
Then you have the Molotov cocktail, which is probably the most powerful weapon in the game, and it's made more interesting by the fact that both it and the medkit require the same materials to craft it with, so you have to choose if you want to go more offensive or defensive. Then you got the Shiv. With this, stealth kills are way faster, and some of the stronger enemies in the game can only be stealth killed if you have one. There are also locked doors in the game that require a Shiv to be opened, and there are always all sorts of goodies to be found behind them. Next up, we got one of my personal favorites, the Nail Bomb. After throwing it, the sound will usually lure enemies right to it, and it explodes when they get too close. It sort of acts like a trap mine in how it only explodes when enemies are near it. If no enemies walk near it, you can just pick it back up afterwards, which makes it pretty OP. You can also craft smoke bombs, which will make enemies not attack you when you're standing in the cloud. They also stun enemies that get caught in the explosion. I never use these more than like twice in one playthrough. The last craftable item is the melee upgrade. This basically makes it so that your next hit will be a one-shot kill. It's important to note that all crafting in the game is done in real time, meaning the game doesn't pause mid-fight when you want to craft something. This makes it so you have to be smart about when you start crafting, and it makes it way more tense. The weapons you can craft yourself are great, but the main tools you'll be using to kill are probably the guns. This game gives you a lot of firearms to choose from. The selection includes a 9mm pistol, revolver, rifle, shotgun, El Diablo, shorty, flamethrower, and the assault rifle. You also have a bow and arrow for long-range stealth combat. Some of the selection kind of feels like bloat, like, do you really need the shorty and the El Diablo if you already have a shotgun and rifle? I feel like they kind of knew the combat wasn't super deep, so they tried to compensate by giving you an absurd amount of guns. but it just makes it more of a pain to sort through your inventory to get the gun you want. Speaking of which, the menu that you use to switch your weapons is splendid. Like crafting, it's all done in real time, so you have to be smart about when you want to change weapons. It's set up in a plus-shaped array, and it makes it super easy to go from your guns, to a nail bomb, to a Molotov, to a medkit, etc. Both your long arms and your side arms have a dedicated slot that you scroll through to find the one you want, and you can find holsters to gain extra slots, making it easier to manage the large selection of weapons. I honestly think I prefer this over a standard weapon wheel. It's super intuitive. While we're talking weapons, all the guns and the bow and arrow can be upgraded by finding parts scattered around the world and then taking them to workbenches that you will periodically find throughout the story. Upgrading stuff is always my favorite part of any video game. All the upgrades are pretty standard, but they don't disappoint. You can buff things like power, range, stability, spread, fire rate, reload speed, ammo capacity. You can add a scope to the rifle. It's great. With how many weapons there are and how many different upgrades you can get, it's actually not possible to max out everything in one playthrough. You'll have to do New Game Plus for that. Another thing you can upgrade in this game is yourself. By consuming drugs, you're able to upgrade your abilities. You're able to improve your max health, crafting speed, healing speed, weapon sway, shivving skills, and your listen mode distance. It's not a super deep upgrade system, but it's still satisfying to complete the upgrade branches. Alright, we got our guns, we got our upgrades, now we just need something to kill. There are many ways you can go about doing this. It is a stealth game after all, so taking out enemies silently is highly encouraged. Being in a post-apocalyptic world, resources like ammo and crafting supplies are quite scarce, especially on higher difficulties. You can save resources by sneaking up and strangling enemies, not too difficult considering video game AI, or if you really need a fast kill, you can use one of your trusty shivs. It's best to usually start an encounter with stealth and try to pick off as many as possible before actually fully engaging. But if you're actually good at the game, you can just pick them all off quietly. Your second option is to just go in guns blazing, meaning you could obviously pick up your plethora of firearms and take them out American style, or you can melee them by throwing hands or using a 2x4. There are two main enemy types you'll be duking it out with in The Last of Us, and one of them is the Infected. The Infected are incredibly aggressive and have no sense of self-preservation. If they see you, they'll charge you head on. There are 4 different stages of the Infected. The first is called the Runner. These are your most basic and weakest form of Infected. These are the people that have recently been infected. People usually turn to this stage within the first 2 days of being infected. They pretty much function as your typical zombie enemies. The next stage of the infection is the Stalker. It takes people anywhere from 2 weeks to a full year to reach this stage. These guys fight quite differently than the Runners, mainly because they take a more stealthy approach. They like to lurk in the dark and sneak up on you. They're used a lot in the game's more horror-focused scenes. But good luck scaring me. I've been hardened in my youth. The third stage of the infection is called the Clicker, and it's reached when someone has been infected for at least a year. They've been infected for so long that they have fungal plates growing out of their eyes, making them blind. They're able to make up for this by making clicking sounds and using echolocation. These guys are significantly stronger than their earlier stages. So much so that you can't stealth kill them through strangling. You have to use a shiv to take them out. You also can't melee them unless you have an actual weapon on hand. Bare fists won't work. So much as touching them will result in an instant kill unless you have a shiv on you and have upgraded your shiv skill. The last and most dangerous stage of the infected is the Bloater, which is a stage that takes several years to reach. The fungal plates that grow on their bodies are so thick that they act as a form of armor. It takes more than just one Molotov cocktail to take these guys out. Like clickers, if you touch them, you're dead. Just like touching Dad's thermostat. The other thing is, a shiv won't save you from a bloater, nor will any other form of melee weapon. Basically, stay out of melee range at all costs. But even when keeping your distance, you're not safe, because they also have the ability to throw these little spore bombs, because apparently these guys weren't scary enough. So those are all the forms of infected you will be fighting. The only other form of enemy you'll be fighting are the human enemies. There's not really much to say about them because they function the same as any other human in video games. But I will say I'm glad they're here because they change up the gameplay dynamics since they fight smarter than the infected, so you have to change up your fighting style when battling the 2 different enemy types. When you're not fighting humans and zombies, the game has you solving puzzles to help pace the story, and they are not good. The Last of Us parades in some of the most basic puzzling sections I have ever seen in any video game. Not only are the solutions super obvious, but the puzzles themselves are incredibly tedious. I'm sure you've heard the complaints, specifically the parts that involve pushing Ellie around on a pallet because she can't swim.
Alright, I need you to...
I know. Step on the fucking pallet.
The controls are clunky and it is just way too slow. I know the whole point of these sections is to slow the game's pacing down and let you catch a breath after big story moments, but even then, you don't necessarily have to force the player to go through a slow, tedious section like that. You can still let them do something fun, it just has to be something to distract them from the main story a bit, such as decent puzzling. I'm not looking for Zelda or Portal level puzzling sections. That's not what The Last of Us is. I just want some that require more thought and are somewhat satisfying to complete. Literally anything other than put wood plank against building, climb on top of building, grab plank again and use as bridge to get to other building. Hooray, you passed! Now I will say I do prefer that they be in the game rather than not, because they do their job in breaking up the pacing, and they aid the story. It just would be nice if they were good. And that is a rundown of the gameplay of The Last of Us. Is it fun? Yeah. As someone who doesn't usually like these types of games, I certainly enjoyed it. Could they have gone deeper with it and had the quality of the gameplay match the quality of the story? Probably not, the story's pretty damn good. All in all, The Last of Us is a work of art. It didn't reinvent what narrative-driven games were, but it didn't have to. It simply succeeded at telling an incredible story that inspired many games that followed. I'm sure you all enjoyed this highly uncontroversial episode of me talking about how much I love a game that everyone else loves, which is why I can't wait for the day that I tell you about how much I loved Part 2.
Do what?
And that's all I have to say on this. Farewell, my friends.